Breaking news. Reports suggest that Canada has rejected a key deal that Trump was seeking, a deal analysts describe as strategically important at a moment of rising economic pressure. While official statements remain limited, sources familiar with the discussion say the proposal involved trade and supply commitments that Washington viewed as urgent. Canada's response, however, was clear enough to signal a decision not to move forward under the terms presented. What we know so far is this: talks have been underway quietly, focused on securing assurances related to critical materials, manufacturing inputs, and long-term supply stability. Reports suggest the proposed deal aimed to lock in favorable access for U.S. industries facing tightening conditions at home and abroad. Canadian officials, according to these reports, reviewed the proposal and chose not to approve it, citing concerns about balance, cost, and long-term impact. At this stage, no full document has been released, and neither side has confirmed every detail, but analysts warn that even without formal confirmation, the rejection itself carries weight. In international trade, signals matter. When a close partner declines a deal described as essential, markets and industries take notice. Canada and the United States share one of the most integrated trade relationships in the world. Goods cross the border daily, sometimes multiple times, before reaching consumers. That level of integration creates efficiency, but it also creates sensitivity. When negotiations stall or fail, the effects can be felt quickly across supply chains that depend on predictability. Reports suggest the deal in question focused on securing steady access to resources and industrial inputs that have become increasingly difficult to source. Energy costs are rising, global demand is growing, and supply routes are under strain. Analysts warn that in this environment, competition for reliable partners has intensified. That is why the rejection stands out. Canadian officials have emphasized the importance of fair pricing, domestic stability, and long-term planning. According to reports, concerns were raised that the proposed terms could place undue pressure on Canadian producers or limit future flexibility. In trade negotiations, flexibility is often as valuable as immediate gains. This could mean that Canada is prioritizing control over its economic levers at a time when uncertainty is high. Analysts note that countries with key resources are becoming more cautious, not less. They are weighing short-term opportunities against long-term risks, including political backlash, infrastructure strain, and environmental commitments. From the U.S. perspective, the rejection highlights a challenge that has been building for some time. Domestic demand for critical inputs is rising faster than supply in certain sectors. Manufacturing, expansion, infrastructure projects, and energy transitions all require materials that are not always available in sufficient quantities at home. Analysts warn that reliance on external partners increases vulnerability when negotiations do not go as planned. This could mean higher costs for manufacturers, delays for projects, or the need to seek alternative suppliers. None of those options are simple. Alternative suppliers may be farther away, more expensive, or less reliable. Building new domestic capacity takes years, not months. Markets reacted cautiously as reports circulated. Some sectors tied closely to cross-border trade showed signs of uncertainty. Analysts warn that while markets do not panic easily, they do adjust expectations quickly. A rejected deal changes assumptions about future supply and pricing, even if no immediate disruption occurs. For Canada, the decision may strengthen its negotiating position but also carries risk. The U.S. remains Canada's largest trading partner. Turning down a major proposal can invite pressure, renegotiation, or shifts in trade behavior. Analysts caution that leverage cuts both ways. Maintaining balance requires careful communication and follow-through. This could mean that Canadian officials will now focus on reinforcing ties with other partners, diversifying export destinations, or tightening domestic policies to protect key industries. Such moves can increase resilience, but they also reshape long-standing trade patterns. For U.S. industries, especially those dependent on cross-border inputs, the message is sobering. Analysts warn that assumptions about guaranteed access may need to be revisited. Companies may respond by increasing inventory, adjusting production schedules, or accelerating plans to diversify suppliers. These adjustments often come with higher costs. Consumers may not feel the impact immediately, but history suggests that changes at the supply level eventually reach households. Higher production costs can translate into higher prices. Delays can reduce availability. Analysts warn that chain stress often shows up gradually, not all at once. The broader context matters. Global trade is already under strain from geopolitical tension, climate-related disruptions, and shifting regulations. In such an environment, failed negotiations add another layer of uncertainty. Analysts warn that uncertainty itself can slow economic activity as businesses delay decisions and investments. This situation also raises questions about how economic power is exercised. Trade deals are not just transactions, they reflect priorities and values. When a deal is rejected, it signals a difference in how risks and rewards are assessed. Analysts note that such differences are becoming more common as countries reassess globalization. The phrase, "the one deal needed most," reflects urgency. But urgency does not always produce agreement. Analysts warn that deals made under pressure can create long-term problems if they are not carefully structured. A rejection today may prevent instability tomorrow, depending on perspective. At the same time, repeated rejections can strain relationships. Trust is built through successful cooperation. When cooperation falters, rebuilding trust takes time. Analysts emphasize that communication after a rejection is as important as the negotiation itself. So far, both sides appear to be choosing measured responses. There has been no announcement of retaliation or escalation. Analysts warn that restraint reduces the risk of immediate disruption, but it does not eliminate underlying issues. Those issues remain unresolved until new talks begin or alternative strategies are implemented. This could mean that behind-the-scenes discussions will continue. Trade negotiations often move in cycles, with setbacks followed by revised proposals. Analysts suggest that rejection does not always mean the end of talks. Sometimes it marks the beginning of more realistic ones. Still, the moment matters. It highlights the limits of influence, even between close partners. It shows that national interests are being defined more narrowly, with greater attention to domestic impact. For ordinary people watching this unfold, the story may feel distant. But the outcomes of such decisions shape everyday life, from the cost of goods to the availability of jobs. Analysts warn that trade decisions made today can affect economic conditions years down the line. As more details emerge, attention will turn to what comes next. Will a revised proposal be offered? Will alternative partnerships be strengthened? Will domestic production efforts accelerate? Each path carries consequences. What remains clear is that in an interconnected economy, no decision exists in isolation. A rejected deal sends ripples across industries, markets, and relationships. Those ripples may be subtle at first, but over time, they shape the direction of trade and growth. This story continues to develop. It becomes clear that Canada's of this deal is about far more than a single negotiation. Reports suggest it reflects a broader shift in how countries now approach economic partnerships in an era of uncertainty. What once might have been resolved quickly through compromise is now weighed against long-term risks, domestic stability, and future leverage. Analysts warn that this decision sends a signal not only to the United States but to global markets. In international trade, rejection does not always mean confrontation, but it does indicate boundaries. It shows where priorities lie and where flexibility ends. For Canada, those boundaries appear to center on protecting economic control and avoiding commitments that could limit future options. This could mean Canada is choosing caution over urgency. In recent years, supply chains have proven vulnerable to sudden shocks. Energy costs, climate events, and geopolitical tension have shown how quickly conditions can change. Analysts note that countries with valuable resources are increasingly reluctant to lock themselves into deals that may look reasonable today but costly tomorrow. For the United States, the rejection highlights a different challenge. Analysts warn that growing demand for key materials and industrial inputs is colliding with limited domestic capacity in certain sectors. When trusted partners decline major agreements, it forces a reassessment of assumptions. Access that once seemed guaranteed now appears conditional. This could mean higher costs for industries that depend on cross-border supply. Companies may need to seek alternative partners, invest in domestic production, or absorb rising expenses. Each option carries trade-offs. Building new capacity takes time. Importing from farther markets increases transportation costs and complexity. Passing cost to consumers risks slowing demand. Markets tend to react not only to outcomes but to uncertainty. Analysts caution that even without immediate disruption, rejected deals alter expectations. Investors, manufacturers, and logistics planners begin preparing for scenarios that include tighter supply and higher volatility. These preparations can slow economic activity even before shortages appear. For consumers, the effects may not be immediate, but history suggests they eventually surface. Prices adjust slowly, availability shifts quietly. Analysts warn that when supply chains tighten, everyday goods become more expensive or harder to find over time. The connection between trade talks and daily life may not be obvious, but it is real. This moment also reflects a broader trend in global trade. Countries are increasingly prioritizing resilience over efficiency. For decades, efficiency meant lower costs and faster delivery. Now, resilience means control, redundancy, and flexibility. Analysts warn that this shift may reduce economic growth in the short term but could prevent larger disruptions later. Canada's decision may be seen through this lens. Rejecting a deal today could preserve room to maneuver tomorrow. However, analysts also caution that repeated refusals can strain even strong partnerships. Trust is built through cooperation, and cooperation requires compromise. Finding the balance between protection and partnership remains a challenge. The absence of escalation so far is notable. Reports suggest both sides are keeping responses measured. This restraint reduces the risk of immediate conflict, but it does not resolve the underlying issues. Those issues, supply security, pricing, and strategic dependence, remain on the table. This could mean negotiations are not over, but paused. Analysts note that many major trade agreements face initial rejection before revised terms are offered. In some cases, rejection leads to better outcomes. In others, it leads to long-term realignment as partners look elsewhere. What happens next will depend on how both sides interpret this moment. Will it be treated as a final decision, or as a signal to rethink strategy? Will alternative partnerships gain priority? Will domestic production become the focus? Each response shapes the future of trade. At a deeper level, this story raises questions about power and interdependence. Economic relationships are no longer just about mutual benefit, they are about risk management. Analysts warn that as competition for resources increases, negotiations will become tougher and rejections more common. For viewers, the significance lies not in the details of one deal, but in what it represents. It shows how quickly economic assumptions can change. It shows how interconnected systems can be affected by decisions made behind closed doors. And it shows how countries are redefining their interests in a changing world. As more information emerges, attention will shift from what was rejected to what replaces it. The choices made in response will determine whether this moment leads to renewed cooperation or gradual separation. The key question remains open. In a time of rising pressure and limited certainty, is it wiser for countries to accept urgent deals or to step back, absorb the risk, and protect long-term stability? Even when the cost is high,